The early 1950s unfurled across a world still reeling from the ravages of global war, now gripped by the icy tendrils of a new ideological conflict. East squared off against West, and the battleground for hearts and minds often lay in the newly independent or soon-to-be independent nations, emerging from the shadows of empire. Nowhere was this struggle more acutely felt than in the Middle East, a region steeped in history, rich in vital resources, and strategically positioned at the crossroads of continents. Here the old colonial order was crumbling, giving way to a volatile landscape where nascent nationalisms clashed with entrenched foreign interests, and the future of an entire region hung precariously in the balance. At the heart of this geopolitical maelstrom lay Egypt, a nation of immense historical significance and undisputed strategic importance. For decades, it had been the jewel in the crown of British influence, its Suez Canal, a lifeline of global commerce and a vital artery for Britain's dwindling empire, connecting Europe to its oil-rich territories and distant dominions. The canal was more than just a waterway. It was a symbol of Western power, a testament to an era of imperial dominance that was by the dawn of the 1950s rapidly drawing to a close. But its strategic value to the West, particularly in the escalating Cold War, remained undiminished, making Egypt a focal point for competing ambitions. A seismic shift occurred on July 23, 1952, when a clandestine group of young nationalist officers, led by the charismatic Gamal Abdel Nasser, toppled the corrupt monarchy of King Farouk in a swift, almost bloodless coup. This was no mere change of guard. It was a revolution that ignited a powerful wave of pan-Arab nationalism, resonating far beyond Egypt's borders. Nasser, a figure of immense popular appeal, quickly became the voice of a new Arab awakening, articulating a vision of self-determination, dignity and freedom from foreign interference. His rhetoric was fiery, his ambition boundless, and his defiance of Western hegemony became a rallying cry for millions across the Arab world. Nasser's rise sent tremors through the capitals of the West. In London and Washington, his burgeoning influence was viewed with profound apprehension. His calls for Arab unity, his non-aligned stance in the Cold War, and his increasingly strident demands for the complete withdrawal of British forces from the Suez Canal Zone were seen as direct threats. The specter of an emboldened nationalist Egypt, potentially aligning with the Soviet Union and controlling the vital Suez waterway, loomed large. For Western powers, particularly the United States, still grappling with the Korean War and the perceived spread of communism, Nasser represented a dangerous variable in an already unstable region. Maintaining stability and securing access to Middle Eastern oil remained paramount. For the young state of Israel, barely 5 years old and surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors, Nasser's ascent was nothing short of an existential threat. Born from the ashes of the Holocaust and carved out of a land deeply contested, Israel's security was always precarious. Its very existence was challenged by Arab nations still smarting from the 1948 War of Independence, and Nasser's pan-Arab fervor promised to unite these adversaries into an even more formidable bloc. A powerful nationalist Egypt, free from British constraints and potentially backed by Soviet arms, controlling the Suez Canal and spearheading a unified Arab front, represented Israel's worst strategic nightmare. The precarious balance of power upon which Israel's survival depended seemed on the verge of collapsing. Britain, meanwhile, found itself in an increasingly untenable position. Exhausted by 2 world wars, economically strained, and facing a global tide of decolonization, its grip on the Suez Canal Zone was weakening. Maintaining a massive military presence there, a relic of imperial power, was becoming prohibitively expensive and politically unsustainable. Winston Churchill's government, despite its historical attachment to the canal, was under mounting pressure to negotiate a withdrawal. The internal debate was fierce, but the writing was on the wall. Britain would soon relinquish its direct military control over this crucial strategic asset. This impending British withdrawal, while a triumph for Egyptian nationalism, created a terrifying vacuum for Israel. The 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, which allowed Britain to maintain troops in the Suez Canal Zone, had inadvertently served as a buffer, a perceived check on Egyptian aggression towards Israel. Now, with the British preparing to depart, Israel faced the prospect of a completely unconstrained hostile Egypt, directly on its border, controlling a strategic choke point, and potentially free to pursue its pan-Arab agenda without immediate Western oversight. The prospect of a strategic disaster, a shift in regional power that could threaten the very foundations of the Israeli state, became a palpable fear in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. In this atmosphere of profound anxiety and strategic vulnerability, a desperate plan began to take shape within the highest echelons of Israel's defense establishment. Led by figures like Minister of Defense Pinhas Lavon, Prime Minister Moshe Sharet, who often found himself at odds with the more hawkish elements, and the formidable architect of Israel's military, David Ben-Gurion, a radical idea emerged. The goal was audacious: to disrupt the burgeoning Anglo-Egyptian rapprochement, to sow discord between Nasser's government and the Western powers, and crucially, to create conditions that might compel Britain to reconsider its withdrawal, or, failing that, to encourage stronger American intervention in the region. The plan, codenamed Operation Susanna, was born of a perceived necessity, a last-ditch effort to avert what Israeli intelligence viewed as an impending catastrophe. Its core objective was to destabilize Egypt, to paint Nasser's regime as incapable of maintaining order, and to demonstrate that Egypt was an unreliable and dangerous partner for the West. The method conceived was audacious and morally perilous: a series of covert attacks against Western-affiliated targets within Egypt, designed to be attributed not to Israel, but to internal Egyptian extremist groups, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood or nationalist dissidents. This was to be a false flag operation, meticulously planned to deceive and manipulate international opinion. The targets were carefully selected: American and British cultural and commercial institutions in Cairo and Alexandria. Libraries, cinemas, and other symbols of Western presence would be bombed, not to cause mass casualties, but to create a climate of fear and instability. The hope was that these attacks, appearing to emanate from within Egypt, would convince London and Washington that Nasser's government was either unwilling or unable to protect Western interests, thus jeopardizing the British withdrawal agreement and potentially leading to a re-evaluation of Western policy towards Egypt. The architects of Operation Susanna gambled that by creating this chaos, they could force a strategic reset, buying Israel precious time, and perhaps even preventing the feared consolidation of Arab power under Nasser. The stakes were immense. On one side, Israel, a young nation fighting for its survival, felt cornered by a rising tide of Arab nationalism and the impending departure of its former colonial protector. On the other, Egypt, asserting its newfound independence, sought to reclaim its sovereignty and influence in the Arab world. Caught in the middle were the fading powers of Britain and the ascendant influence of the United States, both navigating the treacherous waters of decolonization and the Cold War. Operation Susanna was a clandestine gamble, a desperate throw of the dice by a nation convinced that its very future depended on manipulating the geopolitical currents of the Middle East, even if it meant resorting to the darkest arts of espionage and deception. The stage was set for a covert drama that would ultimately unravel with devastating consequences, forever altering the landscape of trust and suspicion in the region. The suffocating heat of a Cairo summer, 1954, pressed down on a city, teetering on the precipice of change. Gamal Abdel Nasser, a young, charismatic colonel, was consolidating power, promising a new era of Arab nationalism and an end to foreign influence. For Israel, still a nascent state surrounded by hostile neighbors, Nasser's rise signaled an existential threat. The British, long the region's colonial overlords, were on the verge of withdrawing their forces from the Suez Canal Zone, a move Israel viewed with profound alarm. A vacuum would be left, and Jerusalem feared Nasser's Egypt would swiftly fill it, drawing closer to the Soviet bloc and further alienating the West. Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of Israeli military intelligence, specifically Unit 131, a desperate plan took shape. It was a scheme born of fear and geopolitical paranoia, a gamble designed to disrupt the delicate balance of power, and crucially, to sabotage burgeoning U.S.-Egyptian relations. The architects of this audacious plot believed that by sowing chaos and mistrust, they could compel Britain to delay its withdrawal and prevent the United States from embracing Nasser's regime. The operation was codenamed Susanna, a name that belied its sinister intent. The chosen instruments for this deception were not seasoned spies or hardened commandos, but a network of Egyptian Jews. They were a vulnerable community, caught between their ancestral homeland and their deep-seated Zionist sympathies, often feeling a profound sense of alienation in an increasingly nationalistic Egypt. For years, Unit 131 had cultivated these individuals, nurturing their ideological convictions, preparing them for a moment that few could have truly foreseen. They were ordinary citizens, students, clerks, professionals, who believed they were serving a higher cause, unknowingly becoming pawns in a high-stakes geopolitical game. The pacing shifts now, a slow, deliberate unveiling of the human elements. Their handler, an Israeli intelligence officer operating under the alias Avri Elad, was a charismatic but ultimately duplicitous figure. He had meticulously recruited and trained them, transforming them from civilians into clandestine operatives. Among them were Marcel Ninio, a young, spirited secretary; Philip Nathanson, a quiet textile worker; Victor Levy, an engineer; Robert Dassa, a student; and the group's nominal leader, Dr. Max Bennett, a seemingly respectable physician. They learned the dark arts of espionage, how to construct incendiary devices, how to plant them discreetly, how to communicate in code, and how to evade surveillance. Their training took place in hushed tones, in safe houses across Cairo and Alexandria, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and the unspoken weight of their mission. The instructions were chillingly clear: bomb American and British cultural centers. The targets were chosen with surgical precision to maximize political fallout without causing widespread casualties. The USIS United States Information Service libraries, the British Council offices, and Western-owned cinemas were symbols of Western influence, perfect canvases for a false flag operation. The goal was not to kill, but to create a narrative, to make it appear as if Egyptian nationalists, perhaps even the Muslim Brotherhood, were responsible for these acts of terror. The evidence would be crude but effective: leaflets, carefully placed to implicate the wrong culprits, designed to sow seeds of suspicion and instability. The calendar turned to July 1954, and the dry, dusty air crackled with anticipation. The first operational acts were not grand explosions, but nervous, clandestine movements under the watchful eyes of their handler. The group was tense, a mix of ideological fervor and palpable fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every passing face a potential informant. The streets of Cairo and Alexandria, usually bustling with life, now felt like a stage for a dangerous, unseen drama. The rhythm quickens, focusing on the initial acts. On July 2nd, a preliminary test was conducted. A small incendiary device was planted in a post office in Alexandria, a seemingly innocuous act designed to gauge the efficiency of their devices and the reaction of the authorities. The explosion was minor, the damage minimal, but it was a chilling dress rehearsal for what was to come. The group, still raw and untested, had crossed a line. There was no turning back. Then came the true initiation. On July 14, 1954, the network struck its first significant target. Philip Nathanson and Victor Levy, their hearts pounding, approached the USIS library in Alexandria. Under the guise of ordinary patrons, they slipped inside, carrying their deadly cargo disguised within books or everyday items. The incendiary device, a simple concoction of acid and flammable liquid, was placed discreetly among the shelves. They exited, blending back into the bustling street, the weight of their act pressing down on them. A short while later, the device ignited, sending smoke and flames billowing from the library. The damage was confined, but the message was clear: someone was attacking American interests in Egypt. Just over a week later, on July 23rd, the operation moved to Cairo. The target was the USIS library in Muhammad Ali Square. This time, Robert Dassa, under immense pressure, carried out the attack. The scene was eerily similar: a quiet infiltration, the careful placement of the device, the hasty retreat. Again, smoke and fire erupted, a stark visual declaration of unrest. Egyptian authorities were baffled. Who was behind these attacks? Initial suspicions, precisely as Israel had hoped, began to fall upon fringe nationalist groups, or disgruntled elements within the Muslim Brotherhood. The seeds of deception were taking root. The pacing becomes more urgent, detailing the expanding scope. The deception continued to unfold. On July 27th, the group targeted a British-owned establishment, the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Cinema in Alexandria. Rossellini, displaying remarkable nerve, carried out this mission. She entered the cinema, found a secluded spot, and placed the incendiary bomb. Moments later, chaos erupted as the device ignited. Panic spread through the cinema, but miraculously, no one was seriously injured. The attacks were deliberately designed to cause property damage and create a climate of fear, not mass casualties that would draw too much international condemnation. The intent was disruption and misdirection, not outright slaughter. The succession of attacks, though relatively small in scale, sent ripples of unease through the diplomatic community in Egypt. American and British officials expressed concern, and the Egyptian government found itself in an awkward position, struggling to identify the perpetrators and reassure its foreign guests. The narrative Israel sought to create was slowly gaining traction. Egypt was becoming unstable, and foreign interests were no longer safe. The hope was that Washington would reconsider its overtures to Nasser, viewing him as either incapable of maintaining order or, worse, secretly complicit. Yet, despite the meticulous planning and the operatives' harrowing courage, the desired impact remained elusive. The attacks were causing alarm, but they were not yet precipitating a major shift in international policy. The Egyptian authorities, though initially bewildered, were intensifying their investigations. The net was tightening, imperceptibly at first, around the clandestine network. The operatives, though driven by a profound sense of duty, were also ordinary people, prone to human error, to moments of hesitation, to the crushing weight of their secret lives. Each successful detonation was a temporary relief, followed by an even greater surge of anxiety, knowing that the next mission could be their last. The shadow of discovery loomed larger with every passing day, a relentless, unspoken threat. The summer heat in Alexandria, July 1954, was a suffocating blanket, yet beneath its oppressive weight, a clandestine operation was reaching its fever pitch. For weeks, a cell of Israeli agents, masquerading as Egyptian citizens, had been systematically targeting American and British institutions across Cairo and Alexandria. Their mission, to sow discord between Egypt and the Western powers, thereby preventing President Gamal Abdel Nasser from forging closer ties with the Soviet bloc and, crucially, to deter British withdrawal from the Suez Canal Zone. It was a strategy born of desperation, a false flag plot designed to frame the Muslim Brotherhood and Egyptian communists for acts of terror they did not commit. But on the evening of July 23rd, the meticulously crafted deception began to unravel, not with a bang, but with a series of errors that would echo through the annals of history. The target that night was the U.S. Information Agency Library in Alexandria. Under the cover of darkness, Philip Nathanson, a 27-year-old Egyptian Jew recruited by Israeli intelligence, approached the building. He carried with him a small incendiary device, carefully prepared to ignite books and documents, creating a scene of anti-Western sabotage. His role was simple, yet fraught with peril. Plant the bomb, activate the timer, and disappear into the labyrinthine streets before the flames took hold. But as he bent to place the device, a critical flaw in the mechanism, or perhaps a moment of profound anxiety, intervened. The bomb detonated prematurely, not with the controlled burst he expected, but with a blinding flash and a searing explosion that tore through the quiet night. The blast ripped through Nathanson's hand and face, instantly transforming the covert operative into a wounded, screaming victim. The sudden, violent eruption shattered the illusion of secrecy. Passers-by, drawn by the sound and the sight of smoke, rushed to the scene. Nathanson, his features contorted in agony and shock, was quickly apprehended by Egyptian police, who arrived within minutes. He was bleeding profusely, his injuries severe enough to prevent any immediate escape or resistance. As he was rushed to the hospital, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place for the Egyptian authorities. This wasn't just a random act of vandalism. The nature of the device, the operative's injuries, and his suspicious behavior pointed to something far more sinister. The carefully constructed house of cards, built on lies and deception, had just begun its catastrophic collapse. The rhythm quickens. Nathanson's capture was the first domino. Under intense interrogation at the hospital, and later at a secure facility, the injured operative faced the relentless pressure of Egyptian intelligence. His initial denials crumbled under the weight of his pain, his fear, and the undeniable evidence of the prematurely detonated bomb. The Egyptian interrogators, adept at their craft, understood the gravity of their discovery. This was no lone wolf. This was a professional operation. They pressed Nathanson for names, for locations, for details of the network he belonged to. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. Nathanson, a pawn in a much larger game, started to name his accomplices, providing the Egyptian authorities with the threads they needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. Within hours, the dragnet expanded. Egyptian security forces moved swiftly, executing a series of coordinated arrests across Cairo and Alexandria. Marcel Nino, a beautiful and charismatic 29-year-old secretary, was among the first to be apprehended. Her apartment was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, hidden explosives, detonators, and coded messages. Victor Levy, a 27-year-old engineer and another key figure in the cell, was also taken into custody. Robert Dassa, Meir Mayuhas, Meir Zafran, and Eliyahu Sasson, all Egyptian Jews recruited by the same handler, soon followed. Each arrest provided further confirmation, more evidence, and additional names, painting an increasingly clear picture of a sophisticated espionage ring operating within Egypt's borders. The scale of the operation and the nationality of the agents sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of Egyptian government. The arrests were not limited to the foot soldiers. The interrogations quickly led to the cell's local handlers. Dr. Max Bennett, a Hungarian Jew who had immigrated to Israel and then settled in Egypt, was implicated. He was a crucial link, responsible for logistics, finances, and communication. However, the true mastermind, the elusive Israeli intelligence officer known as Avri Elad, whose real name was Abraham Dar, had already vanished. Sensing the imminent danger after the initial incident, he had slipped across the border, leaving his agents to face the consequences alone. His escape, while a temporary setback for Egyptian intelligence, only solidified their conviction that this was an operation orchestrated by a foreign power, not a domestic dissident group. A sudden hush falls. The interrogation rooms became a crucible where the carefully constructed identities of the operatives melted away. Under the sustained pressure, the agents, many of whom were relatively inexperienced in the brutal realities of espionage, began to confess. Their stories, pieced together by relentless Egyptian interrogators, revealed the full scope of the plot. They detailed their recruitment by Israeli intelligence, their training in bomb-making and covert operations, and the specific instructions to target American and British cultural centers, libraries, and cinemas. They spoke of the false flag objective, to create the impression that radical Egyptian nationalists were responsible, thereby destabilizing Nasser's regime and poisoning his relations with the West. The physical evidence uncovered during the raids corroborated the confessions with chilling precision. Apartments and safe houses yielded caches of explosives, timers, incendiary devices, and propaganda leaflets designed to implicate the Muslim Brotherhood. Investigators discovered maps marking previous targets, fake identities, and even Israeli currency, a damning piece of evidence that directly linked the network to the nascent state of Israel. These discoveries were not isolated incidents. They connected directly to a series of unsolved bombings that had plagued Cairo and Alexandria in recent months, including attacks on post offices and other public spaces. The pattern was undeniable, a coordinated campaign of terror, executed by a foreign power. The realization that Israel, a nation with whom Egypt was technically still at war but had been pursuing a fragile de-escalation, was behind these acts of terror, was a profound shock to President Nasser and his government. It was a blatant act of provocation, a violation of international norms, and a direct assault on Egypt's sovereignty and stability. The meticulous documentation of evidence, from the confessions to the material findings, became the cornerstone of the Egyptian prosecution's case. They understood that this was not merely a matter of national security, but a powerful political weapon that could expose Israel's clandestine operations on the world stage. The tension escalates. As autumn bled into winter, the Egyptian government made a calculated decision. The trials of the captured agents would be public. This was not merely a judicial process, it was a political spectacle designed to expose Israel's duplicity to the world and to rally international support against what Egypt branded as state-sponsored terrorism. The military tribunal convened in Cairo in December 1954, transforming a courtroom into a global stage. The defendants, including Philin Nathanson, Victor Levy, Marcel Mignot, Robert Dassa, Mir Meyawas, Meir Zafran, and Eladio Sassom, sat grim-faced, their fate hanging in the balance. Dr. Max Bennett, though later acquitted of direct involvement in the bombings, was also tried for his role in the network. The ghost of Abraham Dar, the escaped handler, loomed large, tried in absentia. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with palpable tension. Journalists from around the globe packed the galleries, their pens furiously scratching notes, their cameras flashing, eager to capture every detail of this unprecedented drama. The prosecution, led by skilled military lawyers, presented their case with devastating precision. They meticulously laid out the evidence, the detailed confessions, the recovered explosives, the forged documents, and the undeniable links to previous terror attacks. Nathanson and Levy, their injuries still visible, recounted their recruitment and their missions, their voices often barely audible, yet their words painting a vivid picture of a covert operation gone terribly wrong. Marcel Mignot, composed yet visibly shaken, also provided testimony that solidified the prosecution's narrative. The defense lawyers, appointed by the court, faced an insurmountable task. Against the weight of the confessions and the overwhelming physical evidence, their arguments were largely symbolic, attempting to portray the defendants as misguided individuals coerced into action, or to cast doubt on the veracity of the confessions. But the prosecution's narrative, bolstered by the agent's own admissions, was too compelling. The proceedings were broadcast, allowing the Egyptian public and the wider Arab world to witness the unfolding scandal. The trials became a powerful demonstration of Egypt's resolve to expose what it saw as Israel's nefarious machinations. On January 27, 1955, after weeks of intense testimony and deliberation, the verdicts were delivered. The courtroom fell silent as the judge pronounced the sentences. Philip Nathanson and Victor Levy, deemed the primary perpetrators of the bombings, were condemned to death by hanging. Marcel Mignot, Robert Dassa, Meir Meyawas, and Meir Zafran received lengthy prison sentences ranging from 7 years to life imprisonment with hard labor. Eladio Sasson was acquitted, while Dr. Max Bennett, though cleared of direct involvement in the bombings, was convicted of being part of the spy ring and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The sentences were met with a mixture of grim satisfaction in Egypt and horror across much of the international community, a moment of grim reflection. The immediate aftermath of the verdict sent shockwaves across the globe. News of the Cairo spy ring, as it was dubbed, dominated headlines. Egypt, under Nasser's confident leadership, seized the moment, presenting the trials as irrefutable proof of Israel's aggressive, destabilizing policies. The Arab world erupted in condemnation, further solidifying a united front against the fledgling Israeli state. But the fallout was far from confined to the Middle East. It reverberated through the capitals of the world, forcing nations to confront the uncomfortable reality of a state sponsoring terror. Israel's immediate response was one of vehement, absolute denial. The government, caught completely off guard by the exposure and the public nature of the trials, initially dismissed the accusations as an elaborate Egyptian fabrication, an anti-Semitic plot to discredit Israel and persecute its Jewish population. Israeli officials argued that the confessions were extracted under torture, that the evidence was planted, and that the entire affair was a show trial designed to inflame anti-Israeli sentiment. This narrative, however, struggled to gain traction in the face of the detailed confessions, the material evidence presented in court, and the clear testimony of the defendants themselves. The international community, including Israel's vital allies like the United States and Great Britain, expressed deep concern and condemnation. While some privately questioned the severity of the sentences, particularly the death penalty, few doubted the veracity of the Egyptian claims regarding the false flag operation. The U.S., which had been working to cultivate relations with Egypt, was particularly dismayed by the revelation that its own institutions had been targeted by an allied nation. The incident severely damaged Israel's international standing, painting a picture of a desperate, reckless state willing to resort to extreme measures to achieve its strategic objectives. It was a public relations disaster of monumental proportions, eroding trust and fostering deep suspicion. Within Israel, the exposure ignited a furious political crisis that would come to be known as the Lavon Affair. The central question, echoing through the halls of power, was a haunting one. Who gave the order? Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon, under whose tenure the operation was conceived and executed, vehemently denied authorizing the specific bombing targets, claiming the operation had gone beyond his directives. Yet, the military intelligence chief, Benjamin Ghibli, maintained that he had acted solely on Lavon's explicit instructions. This internal blame game, a bitter struggle for accountability and political survival, would tear through the Israeli establishment for years, leading to resignations, inquiries, and a lasting stain on the nation's political landscape. The executions of Philip Nathanson and Victor Levy on January 31, 1955, just days after their sentencing, marked a tragic and definitive end to the immediate crisis. Their deaths served as a grim testament to the devastating consequences of covert operations gone awry. The Lavon Affair, born of fear and desperation, had not only failed in its objective but had spectacularly backfired, exposing Israel's clandestine hand, costing lives, and plunging the young nation into an unprecedented period of international condemnation and internal political turmoil. The meticulously planned deception had indeed crumbled, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion, distrust, and a chilling reminder of the perils of false flag operations. The pace slows, allowing the gravity to sink in. The desert wind, carrying whispers of a scandal that would forever scar the young nation, had barely settled when the true storm began to brew within Israel itself. The international humiliation of Operation Susanna, the botched false flag bombings in Egypt, was merely the prelude to a far more profound and devastating internal crisis. This was not just a diplomatic incident. It was an existential interrogation, a deep dive into the very soul of Israel's fledgling democracy and its nascent intelligence apparatus. The question that echoed through the corridors of power and eventually into the hushed homes of ordinary citizens was simple yet shattering. Who gave the order? The immediate aftermath of the arrests in Cairo in July 1954 saw a desperate scramble for answers and, more urgently, for plausible deniability. As the identities of the captured agents, mostly Egyptian Jews, became known and their confessions extracted under duress or fabricated, pointed towards an Israeli plot, the government in Jerusalem faced an unprecedented dilemma. Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon, a fiery and intelligent figure, maintained vehemently that he had not authorized the operation. Yet the orders had clearly come from within the military intelligence unit, Amman, specifically from its chief, Colonel Benjamin Ghibli. The stage was set for a clash of titans, a battle for truth that would consume Israel for years. The initial inquiries, conducted in secret, only deepened the fog of suspicion. The first, an internal military investigation, failed to definitively assign blame, leaving a gaping wound in the heart of the security establishment. Then came the Olshan Dori Committee, comprised of Supreme Court Justice Yitzhak Olshan and former Chief of Staff Yaakov Dori. Their task was unenviable, to penetrate the layers of secrecy and conflicting testimonies. Lavon insisted he had merely discussed the possibility of such an operation, never giving the final green light. Ghibli, on the other hand, presented a signed document, allegedly an order from Lavon, and maintained his actions were merely following explicit instructions. The committee, faced with a word-against-word scenario, concluded in December 1954 that they could not determine who was telling the truth. The official response was evasive. A carefully crafted statement that left the central question unanswered, yet the political consequences were swift and severe. Lavon, despite the inconclusive findings, was forced to resign in February 1955, his career seemingly in ruins. The return of David Ben-Gurion from his self-imposed retirement in Sde Boker to reassume the defense portfolio in 1955 was meant to restore order and stability. Yet, the old man, with his formidable will and unshakable belief in the sanctity of the state, brought with him a fierce loyalty to his protégés, particularly Shimon Peres, who had served as Director General of the Ministry of Defense under Lavon, and Moshe Dayan, the charismatic Chief of Staff. Both Peres and Dayan, key figures in the defense establishment, had sided with Ghibli, reinforcing Ben-Gurion's inclination to believe Ghibli's version of events and to view Lavon as either reckless or untruthful. This alignment of powerful figures against Lavon would prove decisive. For several years the affair simmered beneath the surface, a festering wound largely kept from public view, known only to a select few within the political and security elite. but the truth, or at least fragments of it, had a way of seeping out. By the late 1950s, whispers of a cover-up, of manipulated evidence, began to circulate more widely. The issue resurfaced with renewed intensity in 1960, when a former military intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Mordecai Ben-Tzor, claimed that Ghibli had lied under oath and that the document implicating Lavon was a forgery. This revelation ignited a fresh wave of investigations and political infighting, transforming the "who gave the order" question into the all-consuming Lavon Affair. The subsequent investigations, particularly the private inquiry led by Attorney General Haim Cohen, began to expose the cracks in the official narrative. Cohen's findings suggested that Ghibli's testimony was indeed unreliable, and the document he presented was questionable. This created an untenable situation for Ben-Gurion, who had staked his considerable political capital on Ghibli's veracity. The political establishment, and especially Ben-Gurion's Mapai party, was torn asunder. On one side stood Ben-Gurion, staunchly defending his belief that Lavon was responsible, driven by a deep conviction that the integrity of the military intelligence must be protected, even at the cost of a political figure's reputation. On the other, a growing faction within Mapai, led by figures like Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir, began to question Ben-Gurion's unwavering stance, sensing a grave injustice had been done to Lavon. The crisis escalated into an open political war. Ben-Gurion, incensed by the challenge to his authority and his judgment, demanded a clear resolution. He insisted that either Lavon be cleared entirely and Ghibli be condemned for perjury and insubordination, or Lavon remain officially implicated. The stakes were incredibly high, touching upon the very foundations of civilian control over the military and the ethical standards of the intelligence community. The affair became a litmus test of loyalty, forcing politicians to choose sides between the revered founder of the state and a man who, despite his flaws, appeared to be the victim of a calculated deception. In a dramatic cabinet meeting in December 1960, and further deliberations within Mapai's Central Committee, the party was forced to confront the issue head-on. Despite mounting evidence that cast serious doubt on Ghibli's claims, and the growing consensus that Lavon had been unjustly accused, Ben-Gurion refused to budge. His immense prestige and power ultimately swayed the decision. In January 1961, the cabinet issued a statement that, while not explicitly blaming Lavon, effectively absolved Ghibli and thus upheld the original narrative. Lavon was effectively condemned by omission, his reputation permanently stained. This decision, a victory for Ben-Gurion, but a profound defeat for justice, led to Lavon's forced resignation from his powerful position as head of the Histadrut, the General Federation of Labor, a political and economic powerhouse in Israel. He retreated from public life, a broken man, convinced he had been betrayed by the very system he had helped to build. The immediate aftermath of Lavon's final political demise was a period of intense official denial and suppression. The government, under Ben-Gurion's continued leadership, effectively closed the book on the affair. Discussion of the unpleasant business, as it was euphemistically called, became taboo. Documents were classified, testimony sealed, and any attempt to revisit the facts was met with fierce resistance. The official narrative solidified. The operation was either Lavon's responsibility or a rogue action by intelligence officers, but the state, in its wisdom, had dealt with it. This enforced silence, however, did not erase the doubts. It merely pushed them underground, creating a lasting sense of unease and distrust within the political class and among the more informed segments of the public. The Lavon affair cast a long and enduring shadow over Israeli politics. It exposed the raw power struggles within the nascent state, illustrating how personal animosities and ideological differences could intertwine with matters of national security to produce profound injustice. It revealed the potential for military and intelligence services to operate with a dangerous degree of autonomy, challenging the principle of civilian oversight. The affair contributed to a culture of secrecy that would define much of Israel's dealings with its intelligence operations, fostering a reluctance to scrutinize the actions of its security establishment, often justified by the exigencies of national survival. It also underscored the immense, almost unchallengeable authority of Ben-Gurion, whose will, even when questioned by his closest allies, ultimately prevailed. Beyond the political machinations, the Lavon affair left an indelible mark on intelligence ethics. It became a cautionary tale about the perils of false flag operations, the dangers of plausible deniability, and the moral ambiguities inherent in covert warfare. The affair forced a painful reckoning, albeit often delayed and implicit, within the intelligence community about accountability, truthfulness, and the balance between operational necessity and ethical conduct. While it may not have immediately led to sweeping reforms, it certainly seeded a deeper awareness of the potential for abuse of power and the catastrophic consequences when intelligence operations go awry and are then compounded by internal cover-ups. The very idea of "who gave the order" became a shorthand for accountability in a system often shrouded in secrecy. Decades would pass before the full truth, or at least a more comprehensive picture, began to emerge. With Ben-Gurion's departure from the political scene in 1963 and the gradual declassification of documents in the 1970s and beyond, historians, journalists, and former officials could finally piece together the fragmented narrative. The posthumous vindication of Pinhas Lavon began slowly, tentatively. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, with the release of more archives and the publication of investigative works, it became widely accepted that Lavon had indeed been unjustly accused, and that the evidence against him had been fabricated or manipulated. In 2004, on the 50th anniversary of the affair, a more official, albeit still somewhat muted, acknowledgement of the injustice came from within the Israeli establishment, confirming what many had long suspected. The Lavon Affair remains a foundational, if painful, chapter in Israeli history. It is a powerful testament to the fragility of truth in the face of political expediency, the enduring allure of secrecy, and the profound cost of internal conflict. It is a story not just of a botched spy mission, but of a nation grappling with its identity, its values, and the ethical lines it was willing to cross in the name of security. The shadows of "who gave the order" continue to linger, a constant reminder of the vigilance required to safeguard both national security and the integrity of democratic institutions, ensuring that the pursuit of one does not irrevocably compromise the other. Subscribe to Study Z for more contents like these.